Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're heading into day 2 of the 2023 NFL Draft. And as always, we appreciate you taking the time to make Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We're going to have a full episode coming tonight live. Nick Lee will be joining me. We'll break down Seattle's selections in the second and third round and look at best players available going into day 3 with 4 rounds left to go in the draft. But before that point, going to answer your questions. Tons of questions from the 12s coming out of an exciting first round. So those of you that are listening to the show on YouTube, make sure to submit your questions in the comment box. I'll try to get to as many as I can. A bunch of questions off of Twitter as well. If I missed your question, nothing against you. I have a limited amount of time, so I'll try to answer as many as I can here on this bonus episode that is brought your way by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise, this is the game that is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the App Store. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise using the promo code LOCKEDON in all caps in the game. All right, let's kick off this mailbag segment. Again, tons of questions from you, the 12s, on YouTube as well as Twitter. Again, if you want to submit a question in the comment section, make sure to do so, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. I'm going to be balancing between Twitter as well as YouTube and Instagram. I'm using a bunch of different social medias. I got a bunch of tabs open, so try to get to as many questions as I can. First one here coming from Zach Nixon. Darnell Washington of Georgia would be a perfect fit for Seattle's 3 tight end scheme. Why isn't there more hype around his fit with the Seahawks? So I have mentioned Washington as a possibility. I've mentioned the tight end position as a possibility as early as day 2. On my final mock, I had Sam Laporta from Iowa being the selection for the Seahawks in the 3rd round. I don't know if he makes it that deep into the draft, but looking at Washington specifically, obviously there's a lot to like. Really good change of direction skills for a guy of his size. A sound blocker, though I don't think in game that he's as good of a blocker as Michael Mayer from Notre Dame, who is still my number 1 tight end. He is still on the board. He might be a better possibility for Seattle if they were going to go that route. I do think they're going to be much more cognizant on trying to attack the trenches, though, going into day 2, since they picked 2 skill players on day 1. If they're going to go tight end, though, Washington I can see being a good fit. It's just not a position that is an urgent, immediate need necessarily, and didn't have great pass-catching production. You see on film some of the soft hands, but I just don't know that he's quite as polished as some of the other tight ends that are atop this really good draft class. That's just my personal assessment, but certainly his size and the blocking ability, his athleticism, there's a lot to be able to mold into a top-tier tight end, and he could be a fit with their 12 and 13 personnel groupings. Next question here coming from Nathaniel Hoye. Are you thinking the Seahawks will trade back from the first pick of the night to try and gain more capital? I don't see any team biting at John Michael Schmitz, the center, anytime soon. So the second part of that, I will say this. I actually was a little surprised that John Michael Schmitz didn't get picked last night. I thought he was the clear number 1 center, and there would be a good chance for him to go at the end of the first round. Not a given necessarily, but he was the player that I thought had the best chance to get picked there. I think he is going to go fairly quickly in round 2. He might be there for the Seahawks at 37, but there's no way that he's going to be there at 52. So I think if they're going to go that route, it's going to have to be at that selection. Maybe they could trade down a few spots. Those of you that follow me on social media at Corbin Smith NFL, you can see that I actually posted a day 2 mock looking at 2nd and 3rd round picks. I had Seattle trading down with New Orleans at pick 40, so moving down a few spots to get an extra 4th and then packaging their 2 4th round picks to get another 3rd round pick at number 95, trading with the Chiefs. I could see John Schneider doing something like that where he ends up getting 4 picks today to take advantage of the depth at some positions. And maybe in that instance, as you mentioned in the question, the Seahawks will still be able to get a top-tier center, and they can bolster their defensive line as well, and they'll have some extra picks to play with. So there's a lot of different moving parts. Yesterday, there weren't a ton of trades, but I could see there being more on day 2, especially in a draft like this that was not as top-heavy with elite talent, but there's a lot of depth at various position groups. Next question here coming from Karan says, do you think the Seahawks defense will be massively improved with the additions of Bobby Wagner, Devin Witherspoon, and hopefully a healthy Jamal Adams. What do you expect from this defense? So I'm going to say this right now. It's too early for me to know how much better this defense is going to be. I do think that Witherspoon has a chance to be a Pro Bowl caliber player as a rookie, which would be crazy because Tariq Woolen did that last year for the Seahawks. He's that talented of a player, though, and I love the system fit. The real X factor here is, what does Jamal Adams look like coming back from this torn quad tendon? And he's been good, maybe not great, since the Seahawks acquired him. His play has been inconsistent, and I think some of that's been the way that they've utilized him. But we did see the second-team All-Pro in 2020, the pass rushing ability, and I think in the defense that they're running right now, they're really going to be able to accentuate that. I was excited to see what he was going to do last year, and then unfortunately got hurt in the first game. If you can get Jamal Adams back in his pre-injury form, and he's flying around the field, you're blitzing him some, he's making plays against the run. I mean, he's going to improve the Seahawks defense against the run substantially. So I think he is really the wild card in all this. What Jamal Adams are you getting back from this injury? And I think Draymond Jones coming in is going to help their pass rush quite a bit too from the interior. They need to still find bodies up there. So that's why this is really a wait and see situation. I don't know how much better they're going to be. We have to see what the rest of this draft looks like, if they're able to open up some financial space to get a few veterans, maybe bring back a player like Al Woods. There are moving parts here. It's still too early to know whether or not this defense is going to be significantly better, but I like the steps that they are taking so far, including drafting Devin Witherspoon, who was one of my few players that I viewed as a surefire top 5 caliber talent going into this draft. Looking at our YouTube questions, and this one's from Reuben. Says, if Will Levis is available in round 2, do you think the Seahawks take him? So I'm not going to completely rule it out. I actually, right now, he's the highest ranked player that I have remaining on my offensive big board. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think that the Seahawks should take him at pick 37, but we know that John Schneider values elite traits, and there are some elite traits in terms of athleticism and just physical tools from Will Levis. He's got a cannon arm. He can make impressive throws all over the field, off platform, really athletic guy that can run the football, can hurdle over guys. There's a lot to like, but the decision-making process is the thing that has really been an issue for me evaluating him, and why I didn't view him in the same tier as the 3 guys that went in the top 5. I thought he was going to go in round 1. But him falling this far suggests that the league sees some things. And there are also some concerns with a toe injury that he had at Kentucky as well. That's a report that has come out today. I don't know how much that contributed to his fall. But for the Seahawks at 37, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I think especially because they didn't touch the defensive line yesterday, there's just too many other areas that they need to bolster. And they've got a really good starting quarterback. They got a backup they really like in Drew Lock. I don't think at this point that you force the issue. If he somehow was there at 52, then maybe you can have a little different discussion. But I'm not necessarily thinking that that's the direction the Seahawks are going to choose to go with this particular prospect. Jaden Grace. With Seattle's approach on best player available, do you think they will focus on defensive needs later in the draft when center 1, guard 1, tight end 1 are still on the board in the second? I really like this question because we are seeing a carryover from last year where Seattle really went chalk. They were just drafting the best players, in their opinion, that were on the board. They doubled up on corners. They doubled up on tackles. And obviously, they were filling needs doing that as well. But that does create an interesting question about what they're going to do here, because if a player like John Michael Schmitz is still there at 37, even though you desperately need defensive line help, they haven't had a long-term guy at center since they traded Max Unger. I mean, Justin Britt was the starter a few years, but they have not had that franchise center. John Michael Schmitz is that guy. And maybe a player like Osiris Torrance at 37, who was getting some first-round love, you can plug him in and he's your starting right guard for the next 5 to 10 years potentially. So that does create a little bit of a conundrum for the Seahawks, because you want to address the defensive line. As Schneider said last night, they're not immune to that. They know they need to get better in the trenches on defense, but you also want to get best players, and that's what they did yesterday. They got who they believed was the best receiver. A lot of people believe Jackson Smith-Njigba was the best receiver in this class, and then Devin Witherspoon. Most experts believe the number 1 corner in this class. So they are attacking important positions, maybe that aren't the biggest needs, but they're getting premium talent, which you have to be able to compete. I could see that carrying over on day 2 because it seems like the Seahawks have turned a leaf there that maybe John Schneider, some might view yesterday as a curveball, but those were really good football players that they drafted at positions that hold a lot of value in today's NFL. And so it seems like he has maybe tuned things up a little bit. Like, I'm not taking as big of reaches for players and trying to outsmart people. So we could see a center or a guard or even a tight end on day 3. If that's the best player available, they think is going to be able to make an immediate impact. That seems to be where John Schneider and company are leaning now at this point. Question here from JL Drums. Do we possibly see BJ Ojulari with the next pick, or is it John Michael Schmitz or someone else? As far as predictions, we don't know what's going to happen in the next handful of picks. And so that certainly changes things. There's a lot of variance once you get past the first couple of picks in any NFL draft. But I could certainly see, as I've mentioned, John Michael Schmitz, I think he's going to be atop the big board for Seattle there at 37. Ojulari had a top 30 visit. And for those of you that don't think those matter, Devin Witherspoon had a top 30 visit with the Seahawks. And they've drafted a handful of guys the last couple of years. So that is significant. They met with John Michael Schmitz earlier at the Senior Bowl. So these guys all have connections with the team. So I could see either one of those players, though Ojulari at 37 might be a little bit rich, although we've seen a couple other edge rushers come off the board late in the first round. That might be where he ends up falling, the sweet spot for him, a guy that's got some real upside and quick twitch to be able to get off the edge. And so those players make sense. Keanu Benton at defensive tackle. Maybe you would look at Joe Tippmann, another center that would make sense. And to me, the number 2 center in this class from Wisconsin, you could look at either one of those players. Maybe somebody like Deion Henley, the linebacker from Washington State. Those are all names to throw out that would address short and long-term needs on defense or in the middle of their offensive line that could make sense for the Seahawks. Next question here coming from Adam Furley. Should the Seahawks draft 2 defensive linemen in the second round? We desperately need a pass rusher. So this kind of goes with a question I just answered here. They need defensive line help, but you also don't want to force the issue because that is where the Seahawks got into trouble with some of the picks they made. LJ Collier was not a first-round caliber player. But Seattle panicked in that 2019 draft. Like, we're not going to be able to get this position if we don't address it now. And so they picked him much earlier than they probably should have based on what we saw the last 4 years. And so they don't want to end up in that type of a position. I don't think that some of these defensive tackles that are available right now would fit that bill. I think they are second-round talents, guys like Keanu Benton, maybe Gervin Dexter from Florida as well, Siaki Ika, if you're looking for a nose. I would think he's more pick 52 or even pick 83 because he's a big-bodied nose, not as much pass rushing upside, not as much positional flexibility, but still. Those players would make sense, but I think Seattle is not going to back itself into a corner. They are going to be looking at who the best football players are. And if that ends up being a tight end, it ends up being a safety. I don't think that that's going to necessarily happen the way that things have played out now. I had a viewpoint that safety might be a position they look at earlier than expected going into this draft. But the way things have played out now, I'd be really surprised if they went there. But my point is, they're not going to box themselves into a corner like, hey, our defensive line needs depth. Let's just use these 2 picks on defensive linemen for the sake of using it on defensive linemen. They can get some value on day 3 as well. So could they do that? Absolutely. But I could also see a place, or I could see an example of them using their 3rd rounder on defensive linemen and drafting other positions in the 2nd round with those 2 premium picks and still being able to add players at positions of need later in the draft. And that's why they are in, as I've said all along, a pretty ideal situation roster building wise with what they can do with all these draft picks. Going back to our YouTube questions. Having some issues with the questions popping up here. Ty, do you think DTR could be in play much later after addressing other needs? So that is referencing Dorian Thompson-Robinson, the quarterback from UCLA. He is a guy on day 3 that I could see the Seahawks taking a shot on because he's really athletic. He's got a big arm. there's some questions about reading coverage and decision-making that are going to have to be addressed. He is clearly a developmental quarterback, but of the day three guys, he would be one of the couple that I think could make sense for Seattle. I think at this point, though, unless they're really high on somebody like Hendon Hooker or Will Levis falls in their lap, I'd actually be pretty surprised at this point if they drafted a quarterback with the way things have played out. I think that they're content with the two that they've got on the roster right now. They could take a chance on somebody in undrafted ranks or maybe even the 7th round, especially if they recoup a second one. Robinson would be one of the handful of guys that I could see making some sense with his athletic tools. But I would be somewhat surprised at this point if they draft a quarterback now that those top guys are no longer on the board and they were off the board when they were on the clock at pick number 5. Mike Doherty, do you think there's a gentleman's agreement with Poona Ford or Al Woods to come back after the draft as free agents? Sure seems like Pete Carroll and John Snyder have an ace up their sleeve, allowing them to go after other positions with a best player available feel to it. So I'm just going to admit this. I don't have any intel on whether or not those two guys have a gentleman's agreement, but knowing how the Seahawks operate, particularly with older defensive linemen, Seattle has done this in the past where they've let guys go and then they eventually bring them back. And so I could certainly see that with Al Woods. And the fact that Poona Ford has not signed a contract to this point, it keeps the door open for them to bring him back. He could play some nose tackle for you. He can play 3-tech. The cost is going to be the real deal. They're going to have to find ways to open up some cap space, whether that's with extensions, trading somebody. That's probably the least likely. Restructures, not something John Schneider likes to do, but they might have to because they are in a tough financial situation. I think they'd like to bring back one or both of those players, and certainly that could be playing into their strategy here with opting not to draft defensive tackles in the first round. But I think that financials are going to have to certainly be addressed for them to have any chance to do that. Even if Al Woods is willing to come back from a discount from what his contract was before he was cut, or Poona Ford's making a lot less than he did on his last contract, that's still money that they currently do not have. So they're going to have to make some moves regardless if that's what they ultimately want to do, whether they pick a defensive tackle early rounds or not in this draft. Jerry Sweet, who is your if we get out of today with this guy, I'm happy player? That's a really good question. And that's actually a very hard one for me because there's a number of prospects here that I really like that I think are good fits for the Seahawks. But I'm just going to say this right now. You don't want to push the issue of defensive line, but Keanu Benton would be the guy for me because I think he's the best defensive tackle that's left on the board. He can play nose, he can play 3-tech and 4-eye, maybe even slide out in base situations with 4-man fronts and play some end for you in run downs. And he's improved so much as a pass rusher during his 4 years at Wisconsin. You can see some refined counter moves from him, especially his swim move. It's filthy. Was really tearing it up at the Senior Bowl using that refined skill set. So Benton would be the guy right now with the need at defensive tackle. And then I think the couple of centers that I mentioned would be next as far as John Michael Schmitz and Joe Tippmann. Those would be the guys. I think now they've got to focus on the trenches. You don't want to force the issue, as I've mentioned several times here in this Q&A, but those are players at critical positions that they have major needs right now that are really good football players they got a chance to get here with their 2 picks in the second round. So those are the spots I'm identifying. And then anything else you can add after that to bolster your team is sugar on top as far as I'm concerned. Looking at our questions here, seeing if I can find some that weren't already in the chat. This one from Michael Harrison's a really good question. If Anthony Richardson fell to number 5, do you think the Seahawks would have taken him or still gone with Devin Witherspoon? We are never going to know, but based on the conversations that I have had, I think if Anthony Richardson is there at number 5, they draft Anthony Richardson. They were enamored by him. I think Richardson and Devin Witherspoon were the two guys. I don't think they believed Will Anderson was going to be there. If Anderson fell to them, then he certainly would have been a possibility there too. But I think Anthony Richardson and Devin Witherspoon were the two guys that Schneider was referencing last night that they were not going to trade down if they were available there. They're going to draft that guy. Once Richardson was off the board and Witherspoon was there, it became a pretty easy decision for them. This is the player that we're going to pick. But I think if Richardson was there at 5, the talent, the upside, and just the character. They really loved the meetings that they had with him in the pre-draft process. I think that they would have been more than happy to turn in the card with Anthony Richardson's name on it. That's just my viewpoint. I'm not going to say I'm 100% certain on that, but the conversations that I've had suggest that Richardson would have been the guy there at number 5. And Devin Witherspoon, don't call him a consolation prize. It really was 1A and 1B. Those are the guys that they were really excited about having a chance to draft there with that top 5 pick last night. Question here from Jeremy. Do you think the Seahawks ever considered Bijan Robinson at number 5? No, I don't. As I mentioned, I think the two guys that were there at 5, Richardson, Devin Witherspoon, those were the 2 players. And not that the Seahawks wouldn't like Bijan Robinson, because they love their running backs, and this guy's an elite talent. If they traded down, I still don't think that they would have had any interest in him, to be honest. I think that they were in a position where they weren't going to be drafting a running back early, and maybe that shocks some people, but they had other positions of need. They had other elite talents, players like Jackson Smith-Njigba that they were really excited about. They had top 10 grades on. So, no, I don't see any way they would have done that. If they didn't draft Ken Walker III last year, then we're having a different discussion. But that was not a situation where they were going to be drafting a running back, even as talented as Bijan Robinson is here. Chris JR 401, who do you think would be the better center fit, John Michael Schmitz or Tippmann? This is a very close one to me. I think John Michael Schmitz is the better prospect overall, but I think Tippmann is a very fine football player. Both these guys could be Pro Bowl centers, maybe even all-pro centers. A little bit different style game. Tippmann is such a graceful athlete for being a tall 6'6" center. He's not the typical build, and he doesn't look like he would have great lateral quickness, but he moves really well. And so in a zone scheme, the one like Seattle runs, he would make a lot of sense. John Michael Schmitz can win that way, but he's also really, really good in pass pro, and he's a little bit more of a body knocker. He's a guy that can really knock dudes off the line of scrimmage. Tippmann is capable. I would give that edge to Schmitz, though. It's really about preference. And I guess for me, I like the guy that has a little bit more nastiness and a little bit more ability to dominate in the run game. And I think Schmitz is the winner there. But Tippmann is such a great athlete and a really good system fit. So I don't think Seattle could go wrong with either one of these guys. I just personally think that Schmitz is a slightly better player, but it's very close. They are 1A and 1B, so to speak, in the center position. And I think there's a significant drop off after them. Whippler would probably be my number 3 center behind him. Really good player. Just don't think I would put him quite in the same tier as those other 2 Big Ten centers in John Michael Schmitz and Tippmann. Question from Michael Smith. What does Seattle need to do to gain an advantage over the division? So this is really where the physicality and the defensive line comes into play. I like what they've done, and I think Devin Witherspoon's going to help their run defense because he is a really physical player, and it's going to force runs back inside. So I like that addition, but you need to shore up the trenches, and Pete Carroll's been talking about it all offseason long. Got to get more dynamic in the defensive line. Draymond Jones is going to help that with that. They think Jaron Reed still has quite a bit left in the tank, but they need to add to that position. I think in the division, to be able to compete with San Francisco and get over the hump, to be an NFC West championship caliber team, they are going to have to tighten things up with their defensive line. They got to get stronger. They got to get more dynamic. They got to get game changers up there. And so that's where the line has to be drawn here. You don't want to reach again, but can we get one of those top guys that's still available that we can shore up this defensive line? Because I think that's the biggest thing. And I think bringing back Bobby Wagner is going to help because he's still a very good run defender, but they've got to figure things out in the interior defensive line, maybe add another edge to the mix as well. That is how you end up catching up with the 49ers in the NFC West, in my opinion. Last question here on this bonus Q&A. A lot of these questions I've already covered, so I'm trying to hit on multiple topics here. Seeing what questions that I haven't covered to this point. A lot of questions about tight ends, defensive tackles. We've covered them as well. This is a really good one to wrap things up with. There are reports out there about DeAndre Swift being shot by the Lions. would the Seahawks have interest in making that trade? And I'm just going to tell you right now, never rule out anything with John Schneider. There's a strong possibility that he's called around because he looks into everything. But this is a guy that's getting near the end of his rookie deal. There's been some injuries. He was not a first rounder. He was an early second. So it is a little bit cheaper, but still a guy that's going to cost some money for the Seahawks to acquire. So I would say it's slim chance that this trade is going to come to fruition with him coming to Seattle. Not that they couldn't look into it. This is also a really good running back class that I think the Seahawks are going to be able to get day 2, day 3 value with some guys that have starter caliber talent that you can rotate in with Ken Walker III and DJ Dallas. Might even be able to double up at the running back position on day 3 as well, since they only have 2 on the depth chart currently. But I'd be surprised if they trade for an established veteran like DeAndre Swift, even though he's a very talented player. Would make them better in the depth chart. I just don't think for the price and what they're going to have to pay to get him, I just don't think that that's something the Seahawks are going to be looking at as an ideal situation right now. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and other major podcast platforms to make sure you don't miss a single episode. For our everydayers, make sure you're listening in tonight. Nick Lee will be joining me, and we will have a rapid analysis post day 2 podcast. We'll be looking at the picks Seattle made, where these players fit in. Of course, the best players available going into day 3. Going to be an exciting episode. Hope to be listening in. Thanks for all the great questions. Go Hawks.